very nature of capitalism means that it operates within unfettered freedom and space. It also means that in terms of how it's able to actualize and do things the way that is expected, there must be free range to be able to do so. So in the context of this debate, what opposition must be able to defend is a new way of data collection and information that deviates from the normal standards of just looking at Eric and asking Eric if he likes Hawau or whatever it is, and then I'll provide for him. Because by the very nature of people's privacy, there's always that inkling to want to protect it and not allow you to have it. So it means that the capitalism we're looking at here in respect of surveillance would be one that would be intrusive, would be one that would challenge people's privacy, would be one that has to go in deep to be able to get this information that ordinarily you cannot get in very conventional ways. So that is what must be defended by these guys. Two issues that gets us to regret from opening government. One is on this reversal of the natural order of demand and supply that exists in economics, to the idea that it has consequences on other institutions in society, but lacks the control to be able to remedy those challenges that will emerge. I'll analyze both of them to you and why, from our side, we make that moral determination to say we regret it. First point. So if you appreciate the history of capitalism, very basically, what you get is that this innovation has always been driven by the interest of the people and the demand that they exist therein. That means that we exist in this room and there's too much heat. What must happen necessarily is how to address the problem of the heat. That's where AC and all of those things will come in. And because of that, development that is tailored along that line has always been progressive and has put people at the center of it. This debate is really about the people, and that is what every analysis that we do must be justified against what exactly will be in the interest of people who are the unit of analysis when it comes to economic considerations and decisions. And so we say, what this does in terms of the accumulation of information in the way and manner that we are telling you that is very intrusive, is that it looks at the individual actions that people take, puts that together, and creates a logical expectation based on that and bring it to people. That also means that one may not necessarily be a person interested in Eric's iPhone that he's using, but because he likes to talk about China, because he likes to be against the dominance and the hegemony that the US has and all of that, those elements are put together and presented by analysis to Eric by way of bringing inputs from China and all of those things. Within that idea, that's the reversal of the system, where now supply is what is going to dictate what the interests of people really are and all of that, is why we have the numerous miseries and the problems that we have. It doesn't lead to development. This is why. Because it treats development as a quantitative measure, doesn't look at the quality and the individual nuances that exist among people. That's why today there's a lot of global misery, because the things that people are chasing are not necessarily that people intrinsically have developed an interest in. It is because based on an algorithm on your Facebook activity, those things have been presented. But because interest can also be generated and engineered in a lot of those instances, that is created and that in itself is a problem. Okay.
Do you support the capitalist system at all?
Yeah, we support capitalism in the way that it is. But I've told you what the history really is, and I've told you that ultimately, when it is that the interest of the people are at stake, there's always that very open position to juxtapose and take a decision on that. We don't think that if capitalism means competition, you can go ahead and kill everybody who is your competitor because you have taken advantage of that competitor. At that point, you have a problem with that, and we don't think it's inconsistent with checking some of these exigencies that exist in there. Let's talk about consumerism and why that is also very bad. Because today, what we have seen basically is that everybody is chasing the latest iPhone. That is not to say that you want the latest iPhone, that is fine. But the point is that where is that interest being generated from? And that's what we must consider. When at the time of the 80s, when we had neoliberal policies happening in Africa, especially if you look at a place like Uganda, while development practitioners were looking at the impact on how businesses are rising and all of that, there are other consequences of how it affected corruption, because then people did not pay attention to the moral values system that existed in that society anymore, but all they wanted was really who is bringing what material gain to the society. We think that those other considerations that consumerism brings is very, very harmful. And if you look at that and just about that against the interest of the people who are the unit of analysis in any economic consideration, then we say that in itself is a very, very bad level.
Do you think people consented to the Industrial Revolution?
We think that the interest and the demands that people had at that particular moment when the world was moving from a place of chaos and war, and then they needed to progress and do more in terms of production and all of that, raw materials were in abundance, that is what it started. That is what I've realized to you, that demand at all points in time must be the driving force in economic interaction and engagement. The reversal of using supply, because you have aggregated some information about those people and predicted what they want and have engineered their taste, is what we regret. And so we think that that particular one really falls in line with some of the issues that we have. Second level of analysis on why we regret it. We think that if you are taking any decision or anything is happening that can have consequences outside the range for which we think it is instituted, but you cannot have control of that, then that is bad. Here's why. So the information that is gathered here through capitalism and the surveillance of capitalism and all of that is to address a key question of economic development. But that same information was used in the case of Donald Trump to get that bigot who is causing mayhem for a lot of people across the world to be president. It is the same thing that brought to many people being misinformed to vote for Brexit and all of that. So what that means is that it has implications on politics, it has implications on culture. But the people who collect the information for economic purposes have no jurisdiction in these other entities. To the extent that the impact overlaps to that extent, we don't think that it is something that we must necessarily be in favor of. And especially as I've analyzed to you, that again, it in itself is deviating from the core driving forces of economics and all of that. We think that is bad. In terms of politics and all of that, political ideas and policies are shaped by the interactions that exist between the people and whoever wants to be the leaders and all. What some of these things basically do is to allow some armchair political activism where one can sit anywhere based on some algorithm and think that they have informed position on what exactly is good for the society. I think that I would prefer my president to be able to have that interaction, go across the country, appreciate the differences in development challenges, all the nuances there, as against calling Mark Zuckerberg and asking that if you look at the Facebook posts and the likes that go on and all of that, what exactly is the problem of Northern Ghana? And then they'll probably see poverty. But the poverty doesn't give you an appreciation of exactly how that poverty manifests. We think that is very, very important to the extent that this consideration has impact on other things other than the economic intent that was at the heart of it, and economics cannot prevent that from happening. We think that is very regrettable. But most importantly also, we have analyzed to you that the trends that shape economic interactions are reversed by the supply end of things, proudly opening government.
As a patient, you recognize that that doctor can be or has the ability to use that information to harm you. But relatively, you also recognize that without that information, there cannot be provision of better services, especially nuanced information to be able to deal with your specific problems. But the second issue with Karim in today's debate is that he's not able to establish the comparative for us to be able to have a proper debate. Because what he says is that capitalism in itself must thrive on unfetteredness. And then he goes ahead to defend innovation and other elements of capitalism without necessarily having the better divide. I think CAP in its own wisdom has set a specific motion for us to debate. That is conventional capitalism as we have it, as against a more nuanced general surveillance form of capitalism. We think that's the comparative that is necessary. Since he can feel free to bash capitalism on any day, we'll show you in the extensions why we still win on that model. But without that, OG should not place above any other team. So what Karim tells you is that they have the ability to present the information in a way to influence your choices. My extension on the experimental nature of today's data and why the issue of supply and demand can go in both ways, like my knowledge of logistics will deal with that. But then he also talks about consumerism, where the interest is being generated should be very important, and that also seeks to deal with that. But let me deal with that in two ways. First of all, Karim says that, well, consumerism, the interest must be generated from the individual, and if you don't have that, health development cannot happen. We think we appreciate the pure word that came from CEO, and the analysis to that is this. Individuals are not always in the best place to be able to determine where development should be able to go. So Karim says that, well, it is solely based on that interest. But then he also says capitalism should be ready to be able to solve problems. The thing with capitalism is, if your idea is not solving problems, you're not going to have that buy-in. If people's interests do not exist, you are not going to have the perpetuation of that idea to be able to generate profit and to be able to have that money. It means that demand is not solely fixated on the person being able to say, I want to do this or I don't want to do that. Demand is solely fixated on need, and the capitalist ability to be able to identify that need is an intrinsic part of what capitalism in itself means. But then he also says, it is used as a platform to create populism and misinform people. I'll talk to you about better control on that side. So, from our side, we believe, first of all, that privacy in itself is an instrumental right. That is, at every point in time, we are able to influence it in order to create better effects for you. That is how come we are able to take your information in order to provide better security for you as a state. We think that individuals in themselves reserve the right to be able to trade off that information in order to have better services. And that's how come my analogy on the doctor-patient scenario counts, because you voluntarily trade off that privacy in order to do so. And that's the kind of world that we have it. But we also do not think that the propensity of an abuse is like should be the main determining factor in being able to cancel every other utility that exists. Like, that's not how we look at the world. We have benefits and disbenefits of everything, but we don't necessarily cancel it out. But then the fact that privacy in itself is a utilitarian right and is not discrete. That means it does not exist in absolutism. And that is necessarily different from the right to life, where if you are not living, you are dead. We think people reserve the right to be able to trade off a bit of their privacy in order to be able to get that kind of benefits. But on accountability and control, right? We think that there exist different models of control. But then even for that, we have a full-blown privacy where corporations should be able to exploit privacy in most instances. And why is that so? Because the era of targeted advertising means that the consumers have much more power. Why? Because the products are very specific on that consumer. It means that when you refuse to buy, that company runs out of business. It means most of the time, they have way more concern about the consumer. Why is that very important? It means the consumer is able to exert a level of control on most of these corporations by being able to bandwagon and then use accountability to be able to cancel out these corporations, right? The best response from them is to say, well, for these corporations, there are no alternatives that exist. But we think it all forms part of the process of capitalism to be able to create better alternatives for you in that sense. We think it begins from the point where consumers are very dissatisfied with the brand. And that is how come we've seen a lot of social media platforms pop out, especially looking at the abuse that Facebook is coming with. Yes.
So how do you think we can make Facebook accountable?
Right. I've already said, like, the first level is what I analyze, the consumer control. We think, like, there's a certain framework with which all of these things are organized. Like, for the doctor example that I gave you, there are code of ethics that exist for these corporations. There are laws which necessarily exist in most of these instances to check on fair use. We don't think this debate happens in a world where all of those things do not exist, right? So, lastly, let's look at why profits are, why the experimental nature of today's data technology. You need to realize that the boundaries which we've drawn privacy on, and this is very important, the boundaries on which we've drawn privacy on in today is based on a conventional form of capitalism, right? We exist in a dimension where there's much more information flow, and we are still experimenting with the frameworks to view this, especially in the capitalist front. It means that standards which 10 years ago were important are no longer important today. It means that we can be able to trade off most of these things, especially based on my first analysis, to gain some kind of profits that we want. We don't think privacy in itself is a fixed thing that we can say, even in 10 years' time, we don't want to change the way it exists or not. But then why we think this world is better than the kind of world that it was, right? Because in the world of targeted advertising, you have greater competition and you have better prices for the consumer. It means you also create a better feedback loop for the individual to be able to determine what kind of services are important and how the service is harmful to the individual. It means there's greater responsiveness from most of these corporations. But it also means there's less exposure to vicious and generalized forms of advertising, right? We think that's because you have uniquely tailored services, especially for some of these minority groups. Like, for example, for women in the clothing industry, where there were generalized sizes which were necessarily coming out. Within this form of capitalism was then able to deal and address with that problem and ensure that they are not marginalized in the greater society. The best response that seems to come from them is to say, well, they have the machinery to be able to exploit these things to their maximum capacity. But we think, in a world where we show you we can have greater benefits from this, in a world where we show you privacy maybe is not as important as you think, you read from Okom. Thank you very much.
A lot of the contributions and arguments and issues that people of the during this debate are very disingenuous.
they start by the doctor example, by explaining how individuals use the doctor to give information, right? I think that circumstance is particularly different. In the circumstance where you take information to a doctor, you are in control, right? You know that at a particular point in time, you took your information to a particular doctor and got whatever utility from that particular transaction. The circumstances which this debate speaks about are the broader examples. Instances where you cannot exactly place where your information was taken from at what particular point in time. You cannot place exactly what your information is going to be used for at any particular point in time. The control element is what skin is a bit. The example, it is ingenious, and the example falls flat, right? We think ultimately information is good and useful. But the problem that Karim points out in his speech is the problem where the capitalist framework, right, creates problems and provides solutions to those problems. That is what is particularly problematic. The problem is that he tries to speak about conventional capitalism and all that bullshit, right? But we think that where the real shift has happened is in consumerism. Consumerism in the current world is no longer driven by demand, but is driven by supply. I think ultimately what happens and what plays out is that the people, the capitalists, can understand exactly the problems that people face, right? Can understand their mindsets, and in understanding their mindsets, can create problems that were not existent, and now solve those problems for those people. Problems that were not existent, problems that those people did not know about, solve those problems for them and benefit from solving those problems. We think that is what's problematic. He argues that privacy is utilitarian. He says that is absolutely bullshit, right? Because you cannot make that determination for people. We think that privacy is an intrinsic right, and the only time where privacy does not become an intrinsic right is when you commit crime. But when an individual has not committed any particular crime, you cannot say privacy is something that is utilitarian, that we can screw however we want, right? People have to matter, and their own determination, their own value ascriptions have to matter. So you're saying that privacy is utilitarian and not even giving any analysis about it is actually completely flawed. And that's quantification, right? You can't get away with that. At the end of the day, he speaks about control and he says there are code of ethics and all those things. But vitally, Karim explains to you that the political class significantly benefits from aggressive data collection. And that means that since the political class benefits, those are the people who should be the legislators. Those are the people who expect to exercise control. But to the extent when they are benefiting significantly, we don't think that they can exercise the kind of control that is necessary to create any meaningful revolution in the same people. We think that the power that exists for those capitalists is very, very uncontrollable and it's very, very insidious. Then about conventional capitalism and experimentation, all that bullshit. We think that that's all bourgeoisie fabrication, right? Saying, well, we are experimenting in this particular circumstance. The bourgeoisie drive the market, right? And we think that this debate cannot be an evaluation of the bourgeoisie alone. This debate is an evaluation of exactly all the actors involved in the debate. And we tell you from our side that the people matter, that the market matters. Right? You cannot just look at it from the perspective of your people, right? The people who are there, the consumers actually matter, and we think that that should play out. But then it speaks about science, and we think that science is important. Yes, we agree. We think that it's right for people to make permutations, make prognosis to predict. The problem, however, is that what the world of surveillance capitalism has is excessive control which exists on the part of the capitalists. Right? The problem is that on our side, on the side of conventional capitalism, which is the dichotomy we just create, we think that people have control. At best, economists could predict. At best, economists could look at prognosis, could make prognosis, could look at future and past trends, and also try to predict the future. Meaning that people have more control. That control doesn't exist in the world today. We think that is something that we must close with.
Do you think we should give people responsibility over their urges?
Over their urges. Well, I don't necessarily think that people should have responsibilities over their origins. I think like the duty of the state is not to infringe on people's rights at the point where they have origins, right? The state has to wait for those origins to materialize actually, right? For any significant action to take. Because at the point where you want to infringe on people's origins, you think stereotypes happen. Because black people can have origins that different from white people, and then you significantly oppress black people over white people. So we don't think trying to read people is something that we should go back and fix your case, right? Ultimately, capitalism is about competition, right? It's about gaining advantages over others, regardless of regulation, right? Opposition has to defend the most aggressive data collection possible, right? Because in a world where surveillance capitalism is the baseline, for any billionaire, for any company to gain advantage over another company, you cannot do the basic thing, right? You have to go deeper, and that's where the game theory comes in. Because if company A has basic information and company B has basic information, everybody is even there's quite an ability for company B to have advantage over company A. They have to go deeper. That is intrinsically problematic for three reasons. First, there's more intrusion of privacy of people's lives. Second, there's less incentive politically for direct human interaction, like Karim explains to you. And thirdly, there's more social political control over the market. Karim explains to you how consumerism plays out and how the capitalists now drive the market and how that's very problematic. Second, politics. Understanding people's mindset is always key in disrupting the political landscape, in doing things like gerrymandering, right? Which involves disenfranchising people. So a politician can sit back in his house and know that this demographic will not vote for me. What does he do? He draws them out of the map, right? That information is exponentially harmful. The question at the end of this debate is, what do people want? This debate cannot be about big data, corporate bodies, and all of that alone. The debate must look at people, you and I, right? Benefits abound on their side. But are people really happy about surveillance capitalism? We see complex evidence on social media that suggests otherwise. But the point is simple, right? People like the ease of targeted advertisements, but the question is, are they comfortable knowing that Siri is not just a friend, but also a spy for tech companies, right? We think yes, from smartphones, people can predict, the companies can know you're about to get pregnant and can give you targeted ads. But the point is that those companies can also know about your political preferences and can use what and can sell those data to major political parties, and that can be used to exclude you. I think that's not people. The debate is about people, it's about what they want and their own.
The problem with government, we don't really understand capitalism. First of all, you can't be a proponent of capitalism, as Karim today has said to the people, and be against consumerism, because capitalism wants to play on people's edges. Wants to play on people's edges to ensure that they are able to sell a product. That is also ultimately why the Trump example and political example about it falling out of the confines of this debate falls out. Because in essence, politics is also a good that was sold. Trump was a product that was sold to people, and propaganda is a valid way of selling information. What you should be speaking about in this debate is if people intrude people's privacy, if companies intrude people's privacies to ensure they get this data, as like Russians did for Republicans and as the Democrats themselves did, why is that competition bad? That competition of intrusion. Again, the problem with opening government is also that they assume that economics is a demand to supply issue. That's because Karim absolutely has no understanding of supply side economics. So, for example, when it comes to monetary policy, state supplies more money in the system or decides to withdraw money from the system to determine the kind of rates that should apply, because that is how the state controls the supply side of that economics. So, economics is not necessarily that by default it's a demand to supply issue. You misunderstood that. Finally, they also say that control, like guys. They speak about control. Later, my analysis, I'll show you why. Because they want innovation, and because of how markets are becoming complex, control is the least important thing capitalists should be thinking of. Then again, they talk about how they prefer an approach where corporations go out to seek information. unless you make the Erasmus complex like analysis of why we are within a new space where data is the new oil, and that brings you to a new case. Data is the new oil because we are in different times. We are in times where society has always wanted to use choice architecture to determine what people do. But the reason data is becoming increasingly important is because we need to be able to sift through consumerist choices to be able to compete. Why is this very important? Because of three major issues. First of all, because of the rapid population growth that is going on all over the world, it means that at all points in time, more must be done to be able to ensure that companies are able to compete as far as data is concerned. But secondly, because of the new emerging markets that are taking global prominence and dominance, like India and China, it means that there must be a new approach to how data and markets are exploited. Why is this very important? Because this means there is a general global power shift. And for that global power shift, for any corporations to be able to interact with any part of the world, they need to be able to exploit data. That is why, if faithfulness missed it, Erasmus was for intrusion of people's privacy. But why did Erasmus say this for people's intrusion of people's privacy? Because the reason regulation has failed with the status quo is not because the ruling class are the ones that control policy and they want to ensure that data is like exploited as faithfulness wants to say. Because else, why would the Democrats in power and not regulate data that could have ensured that they could have continued to keep the power? The reason policymakers are unable to regulate markets and data markets in the status quo is down to two things. First of all, because there is a general lack of understanding by policymakers of the new data age. You realize even during Senate hearings of like with Mark Zuckerberg, people are asking, how do you Google? Like they have absolutely no understanding of the new data age. But secondly, data in itself is still largely experimental for even the tech giants we are talking about in this debate, Mark Zuckerberg and co. And that means that there is a new definition of what the boundaries of privacy means. So since there is a new definition of what the privacy of boundaries means, the boundaries of privacy means, it means we must always find a way that ensures capitalists are able to survive in this market. That is where my case begins. The reason intrusion is the best way to secure information is because people's assessment of their behavior is not always valid, and the vast number of instances is a glorification of themselves. That is why when you want information as a pornographic company, when you want information to know how people like their porn, people are likely to even deny that they watch porn. We think that the intrusion of their spaces to be able to know that they Google porn from time to time is what is able to give you the kind of targeted advertising that delivers this. But then again, in human participatory systems, the thing is that for any system to work, there has to be a human participatory system. And that is why faithfulness final question is important. What do people want? You say that people don't necessarily know what they want. So for example, how does innovation happen? If you inform that ask people for what they wanted at the time before making a car, people would have likely asked for a faster bicycle or horses that did not need water. Because that was the boundaries within which their minds operated. For innovation to happen, it takes a lot of genius and also to be able to have a lot of data analysis, things that are complex for individuals to make. So for a capitalist market, that is the way to go. But finally, the problem with capitalism is that people feel that capitalism is too distant from the state. And that is why their case on consumerism is a contention that we like to clash. Because the problem with consumerism is not that corporations are producing things like producing things just exceptional. It is that things are being produced that companies don't know people need. That means for companies to be able to fix that,
is it your contention that people do not have a right to hide that I watch porn?
We think that you have a right to hide that you watch porn, but that's why Erasmus tells you that is not a discrete right. A discrete right exists on a 0 or 1 basis. That means that for example, the right to life. You can't say you have a right to live a partial kind of life. When it comes to the right to privacy, faithfulness says that your right to privacy is only taken when you commit a crime, which is wrong. Because the state, for example, when during times of war, etc., when it has to be able to ensure that for example, when it has to be able to ensure that it finds data on the kind of people in their community, people are entering their state, they sometimes go to people's private spaces to be able to ensure that they get the information. That is because the information is going to be instrumentalized to be used for a greater good of protecting the state. People, even in a lot of instances, consent to the state infiltrating their right to privacy, something that they will not allow other people within their spaces do. Why is this very important? It means that for us in this debate, we are allowing capitalist companies to take the role of the state in ensuring that their markets work by intruding people's spaces. This thing exists with states, and we want capitalist corporations to be able to do that. So in ending the case, the problem with capitalism is that companies are producing things people don't need. We now have a way through data assessment to be able to intrude people's spaces, to get the information, to be able to produce what people need. What people want is what we produce. If they don't want it, they don't buy it, and we fall out of business.
We believe that social capitalism redefines privacy and human intimacy in a way that is both harmful to society and capitalism itself. We believe that the commoditization of that privacy and competition that comes with it makes it so that human beings do not have the control, makes it so essentially that the market is no longer free. The first thing that has happened in this debate is about choice architecture, right? What do people want? Do they know what they want, right? And how does capitalism solve that problem, right? We think that we're very okay to agree with the other side in saying that people don't know what they want. In fact, people want to be led. People want to, that's the whole essence of advertising, to convince people. But we think that what people want, and this is the first clarity we're bringing to this debate, is that human beings always should reserve the agency to decide what they would buy and the extent to which they would go in like consuming things. So we think that the way surveillance capitalism works is to erode this in entirety. So that's our first extension, right? So surveillance capitalism, right? When you have much more information about people, the other side is going to have, you guys are going to compete on how you use that data. This can suggest that what capitalists are going to do is that they're going to care about us more. So they are going to produce things that we most likely care about. We think that that is false. We think that what is going to happen is the undermining of people's autonomy and self-determination in a way that they will effectively have no choice over what they consume. We think that essentially, like, buying things, consumerism is about a game of conviction. I think this was what is like in opening government's case, right? It's about a game of conviction, it's about convincing people. But we think that capitalists would not go through the brunt of convincing people, even to cost them more. What they would then do is to first off override that agency, defile that agency, or ignore everything about you. So they are not going to care more about you, they are going to ignore everything about you. So how do they do this? Three reasons. First, it's either they convince you when you know less. So they make sure that the information that gets to you about products and services is not enough. Secondly, what they do is they know that you'll be more likely more convinced when you do not know enough about what you are consuming. The third part is, which is bad, is they know that you will most likely be convinced when you even know the wrong things. So they deliver you information that is not accurate. But now because they know much about you, now because they know the things that you are vulnerable to, now because they know the things that you are most likely going to believe, you do not have any safety measures against that sort of things. We do not think that, we think that this is very, very regrettable. The second thing we analyze to you is how this redefines privacy. So you have to understand in today's debate that this cannot continue to go on, right? People are entitled to their privacy, right? People would want to keep some things secret. But in a world, and this is where this debate happens, the projection, in a world where you know that corporate organizations now have access to your privacy, what do? We think that there are three sort of things you would do, right? We think that there are some people that, despite the things you not share, there are some people that you want to be vulnerable with. There are some kind of intimacies, the kind of people you want to share. There are some kind of things you want to share with people and the things you do not want to share. We think that human beings are entitled to the things we want to ventilate in the open and the things we want to suppress. Even the things we want to suppress, we share it with those who are close to us. But you cannot do that in a surveillance capitalist age because you know that Facebook has access to what you tell your mom. Facebook does not even only know about what you tell your mom. From what you tell your mom, Facebook can deduce who your mom is. That is called shadow profiling. So we think that when people do not longer have access to their own vulnerabilities, when they are not longer entitled to that privacy at that level, there are three sort of things that they would try to do. First is to suppress those vulnerabilities and channel the energies in ways that are very, very destructive. Secondly, we think that they can also find other means to vent this sort of vulnerability. So, for example, people would break firewalls in China just to communicate with the outside world. But we think that if this becomes the hallmark of the capitalist world, what you're going to have is an internal revolt that destroys capitalism in itself, because human beings want to preserve their autonomy. Human beings want to preserve their self-determination. We think that they cannot be able to do that in a surveillance capitalist world, and that is very, very problematic. The last thing we analyze to you is how the commoditization means that human beings and the way we consume things, I'm going to take you, exist along 3 levels. First, knowledge, interaction, what do we want? But more importantly, authority, and how and why should we want what we want? But the last one, which is more important, is power. Who decides? The persons that decides who knows. We think that what capitalism does is to make sure that the process of power is captured to the extent that you do not have accountability. So we used to search Google, or Google now search us. So Google now, or for example, digital services now see us as the payments, as the service, for example. So what this means is that there is always an incentive for capitalists to capture that power that makes them accountable in a way that human beings erode their self-determination. Isaac?
Yeah. All the problems you mentioned about less information are problems with markets and capitalism, and they are not specific to surveillance capitalism. Is it that you get the very idea?
The reason why they are specific to surveillance capitalism is that with surveillance capitalism, you know things that, for example, like the kind of things you do in your bathrooms. Alexa knows. It is given that information is available to capitalists, and you do not control who those information are being sold to. You do not control how the extent to which they go, right? Final extraneous reporters. These guys say, well, we need to know more about people to solve their problems. What this says, you are creating problems. But what we say is that what you now do is to find ways where people can cope with problems. When you know much about people and you don't want to consume a product because it is harmful, what you're not going to do is to withdraw that product. If it is making money for you, you're going to find a way to make sure that they buy that product by delivering misinformation to them and all of those things that I analyzed earlier. These guys say, well, we can control them. But seriously, these guys tell you that well, it benefits power. But we tell you that power would always play catch up with technology. That is why during Zuckerberg's testimony, people were asking very silly questions. The guys who are supposed to control do not know. At the end of today's debate, this debate is about human beings, it's about free markets. The major importance of free markets is people being entitled to their self-determination. Surveillance capitalism erodes the autonomy of people in a way they cannot recover from at a very fast speed.
Madam Speaker, I don't know about you, but I was a little bit confused by the opening remarks. Why on earth are we debating the trade-off between conventional capitalism and surveillance capitalism, when this debate is clearly asking us to look at the rise of surveillance capitalism, how that happened, and how it is going to continue to be in the future? It took like all of about 28 minutes for the first person in the debate to mention Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, when all of these guys were having these lofty ideas about the ideology. The reality is that Facebook and social media platforms are the reason why surveillance capitalism exists in the first place. There are reasons why it is beneficial to our existence. Our extension is going to have 3 parts. Firstly, we're going to show you that the rise of something is necessary for its future and that it is beneficial to individuals. And then we're going to tell you that there are 2 assumptions on the government case. They say that people lose, and they say that people didn't have the ability to consent. We're going to show you that people didn't actually lose anything at all, and then they did consent to having surveillance capitalism in their lives in the first place. Let's look at the rise of it at the start. And you know, you might be a little bit nearsighted and say the rise of something is all that consists of it. But you need to recognize that it is a necessity for it to be continuing into the future. And what this means is that, yes, there might be some flaws at the start with any business or with any policy, but there are some sort of adaptations that we continue to make to ensure that we optimize that specific system. The way in which surveillance capitalism was viewed a year ago is vastly different to the way it is now because of continued regulations that we tried to impose. And here's shit that you didn't get from our opening. Initially, the reason why there was no regulations to surveillance capitalism is because the system didn't exist. There was no system to regulate for us in the first place. And that has systematically changed. People like Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai, which is the CEO of Google, and people like Jack Dorsey have testified to Congress as a result of the outflow of surveillance capitalism, where they had to explain what sort of ways in which they use that data for. They had to explain what the data was going to be useful for the company, and also in which ways it was going to be used to be profitable. It is ridiculous to assume that there is absolutely no transparency in this process, where people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is a representative of the people, right, had the ability to question these CEOs, which means that we did have an interaction between the people and those CEOs to begin with. You need to also note here that they have the ability to adapt like all regulations have in the past. The way we regulated the banks in 2008 is vastly different to the way it is now. We established the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 to ensure that banks cannot take or allow people to take out risky loans and mortgages on their houses. It's ridiculous to assume that it's going to stay and remain the same. Second part of our extension, please give me some time. When do you lose? When you lose something, when you interact with these individuals. And you need to note that this is an interaction between a corporation and individuals on the ground. Let me give you an example of where someone does actually lose something. It is when it is quantifiable. So for example, when I defame someone, like a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer, by saying they've been acting negligently in the past, they lose income as a result. They have the ability to not exist in the future because they were falsely accused of being negligent. The impact that this has is that individual can quantify the loss of income that they necessarily had, and as a result sue that person for defaming them. You cannot quantify the value of your personal data. There is no quantity to which your name and surname and your cell phone number is currently attached. And you guys didn't give us any of that sort of stuff. So it's free for us to extend upon in closing opposition. But there has even been a change. Google paid individuals to participate in one of its projects to optimize the Google Pixel phone. For individuals to give their face as a result, to optimize like facial recognition, they paid individuals in $10 to $15 per picture that they took. So they did quantify that sort of data. That is yet again another example of progress that happens as a result of surveillance capitalism. Nothing that you heard from our opening. Lastly, I want to note here that there is an exchange that happens as a result of surveillance capitalism. Because Facebook exists, Facebook require ads to exist in the first place. And without those ads, Facebook wouldn't exist. Which means people won't have access to communicating with their friends. They won't be able to market their own businesses. They won't have the ability to access the news. So there is an exchange. People do give up their data, but in exchange they give the use of the platform Facebook, which they get to use for fucking free, right? So that is the exchange. That is the benefit that people gain in the first place. No, thank you. Sure, Francois.
So today, data is a massive enterprise. That data protection is a massive enterprise by the same people who gather the data. Explain why that problem exists when you create a problem and sell a solution for it.
I have absolutely no idea what you just said, but I think what you're trying to get to is that they aren't the people that are trying to sell the solution. There are many actors in this debate and many active stakeholders that are trying to regulate it and sell the solution themselves, but not just those individuals. Could people consent? Last part of our extension. Yes, they weren't vulnerable. They had the ability to sign off on terms and conditions. They had the ability they weren't under any duress to sign off under those things in the first place. So you say that they have that ability to consent. But also, what do they actually lose? Because, like, these guys go on to say that people spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on, like, stupid shit that people are marketed for. They don't give us any example of that. But let's be realistic. The only thing that you really lose in that instance is your disposable income. Because most of your actual income that goes to your home loans, mortgages, cars, all those sorts of things, is already tied up. Those things are already going to the banks. Those are things that you aren't going to lose in the first place. So at the very, very worst, these guys lament the fact that people are losing their disposable income in a month, which most ordinary people don't even have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alright. So, panel of the House. CEO comes to this debate and says basically that the engagement we have from the opening half are somewhat irrelevant to this debate, but then they contribute like this irrelevant material to the debate. So basically, CEO has no understanding of the context in which this debate comes in, and that's why the member of opposition can say that the only thing people have to lose is their income. But that makes absolutely no sense, because what people have to lose from the erosion of their data basically is their rights. Privacy as a right, to have infringement of privacy. They also have to lose like certain choices. It's an infringement of the choice architecture of individuals. So you can basically determine the kind of people, whether people are going to vote for a particular person or they're going to vote for another person based on how you infringe on their data. So there's a lot for people to lose beyond whatever. Then they say that now people can consent, right? So there's no problem when you consent for it, you sign into it. But panel, understand that the important clarification Tayo gives is that people who lose their data are not just people who sign up to it and consent, but there are also other people, right? So I may not sign up for Facebook, for example, but because my mother posts a particular information about me or not necessarily about me, I stand to lose my personal information and data from this. So it's not just about people who consent, it's about people who have any sort of relationships with individuals who consent. And now the same people can now have value and benefit for their data, right? So before there was no value for their data, but now people can have value for their data. Finally, we see that there's a problem with this. Basically, we are creating a world whereby we have a system whereby we cannot hold people accountable for what they decide to do. So Facebook becomes so powerful because they say there's transparency, right? But we can't get transparency. Like, who is going to hold Facebook to book? Who has capacity to hold Facebook to book when they have the money and capital, and they don't just use things that we understand, right? So there's a knowledge asymmetry. Facebook has the capacity to use artificial intelligence, to use things that we may not be able to relate to and understand, to get our data and use them against them. So there's no transparency. We are trading with individuals who we cannot hold to book, who we cannot account for. We see the crisis with Facebook, and there was basically no accountability for them because they become so powerful when they can hold people's data and use it against them. The extensions we get from Taya's speech is the most important thing and what answers the question in this debate. So basically, I'll be engaging open opposition as an integrated method. So what we get from Taya's speech first is how we see that is an erosion of people's agency to determine what they want. The most important thing about capitalism and free market is that people should decide what they want, whether or not we think they know what they want or how they want these things. And we don't think that we should support a system that erodes this. Why? Because first we see that when people see that they have the capacity to determine what you want, we have a sort of manipulation of the type of information that you get. So what they do basically is to endanger knowledge structures. And they will do it because we get this idea from open opposition, like they will do the best thing for people. But that's not true, right? Capitalist structures have no incentive to protect people. They have the incentive to sell their goods, right? So it leads to a sort of misinformation. They basically force you to buy these goods, but they create a sort of new world order where we have new needs being created in the world. So people now decide to buy what they are selling to you because they think they need these things, but they do not actually need these things. Now, we also see, as Tayo tells you, that this redefines human privacy and intimacy. Right? There are certain information that are private to you. That's why we protect privacy, right? That's why privacy is a right. Because we have the obligation to protect individuals' vulnerabilities. But like what I'm vulnerable to, things I want to keep secret, should not be open to the market, should not be what we buy and sell, basically. So when we have a situation whereby we access people's vulnerabilities, we do two things. First, people will decide to suppress their vulnerabilities, and secondly, they will decide to channel this to other things, right? So to other destructive things that we think are bad to capitalism. But we think surveillance capitalism also leads to an erosion and destruction of capitalism, because when we say we want to erode people's vulnerabilities, people's right to privacy, what we get is a sort of revolt against the very system that wants to attack them, right? So, like, there's an attack, because capitalism presents a personal affront on people's rights. There's an attack, a response basically from people to attack this thing that wants to.
If you willingly give your information to somebody and the person manipulates it to get you, should the state say because you gave it out, it is okay? If no, it means people don't, the privacy is not the most important thing.
No. See, whether you willingly give out your information or you do not is not really what is important. Privacy still remains like the most important consideration in today's debate. And this brings to what we heard from Erasmus. So Erasmus says that privacy is an instrumental right, and like that's the premise of their case, because they are trying to run a case that privacy is not so important. Information can be taken for the greater good. We may accept this from closing government, but we think that there's a big problem when you define what the greater good is and who determines the greater good and who takes it in the first place. Like, who takes the information? People who want to use it for their personal gains, they don't care about it. So it's not about what you want, it's not about your own gains as individuals who want to purchase a particular thing. It's about what they want. So when they take, when they make your privacy something that is for sale, it's not for any greater good. They just create needs that you don't want, and they, people basically chase this sort of needs. So, panel, another thing Tayo brings to you is how like the free market works, right? So the three things he says are very important are knowledge, authority, and power. And we think this is very important in today's debate, because capitalism, the premise of capitalism is free market. The premise of capitalism is not forcing needs on people, right? We have advertising doing that. But when we have targeted advertising, when we have erosion of privacy, what we have is a change in power structure, a creation of a new powerful elite, if you can call them that, who do not have the capacity to be controlled and to be held accountable by the people. Every powerful structure that we have as a world should have the capacity to be held accountable, to be controlled. But what we have when we have people who erode our data and become so powerful based on the use of our data, they become so uncontrollable that they can determine what we need, they can determine like the channel or the path that the world goes into without any sort of control on them. This debate is very much people-centered. We do not want a sort of system that invades people's privacy, their intimacy, and gives them no access to expression of their vulnerabilities. We're very proud to propose it.
Honourable Speaker, it's important for us to recognize that as people, we have agreed to live our lives online. And while certain aspects of that might be frightening, these are not regrettable. What they are merely natural consequences of what it means for people to evolutionize and to move forward in life. What we ought to recognize in this debate is that there are two key things that we have, two key questions that need to be asked. The first, which is the least relevant question, is whether or not conventional means of capitalism are preferable. We're showing that this is a question that is moot at best. But secondly, and more importantly, is whether or not surveillance capitalism is something that actually harms people in ways that are regrettable and ways in which we aren't able to regulate out. What we show you in our extension as well as this speech that we have been able to regulate this, we've been able to improve it. But more than that, we show you why surveillance capitalism is actually beneficial. So on to the first question then, whether conventional capitalism is something that's preferable, and we show you that it is not. We have to respond to things that we hear in opening government. The first thing they tell us is how surveillance capitalism is something that necessarily increases the kind of hyper-consumerism, which in itself is a condition of capitalism. The first thing to recognize here is that they don't show us why this kind of hyper-consumerism is something that is inherent to surveillance capitalism, and why other means of consumerism that are created as conditions of capitalism are things that are either less harmful than surveillance capitalism, or things that wouldn't necessarily occur as a result of that. Secondly, is that we also need to recognize that hyper-consumerism is something that doesn't occur in a vacuum. We tell you that there are vast numbers of marketing tools that have the ability to be even more nefarious and even more invasive than targeted ads that you see on Facebook. Or to tell you that there are more corrosive factors that occur there. But lastly, we need to show you that there are means in which this kind of consumer is something that's able to add value to people's lives. If individuals see the ads that they want to see on their Facebook based on, for instance, their personalities, and they're able to get better access to the product, we show you that that's something that isn't necessarily a bad thing. What opening government does is problematizes certain conditions that are created by capitalism, but doesn't show us that this is necessarily linked to surveillance capitalism. The second thing that they should tell us then is that competition has a driver of capitalism and why surveillance capitalism makes it worse. The first thing that we need to recognize here is that they give us absolutely no examples of any corporation that's actually, for instance, participating in this hyper-competitiveness that makes them dig and dig for more of your information. But the second thing that we need to recognize is that if this debate in opening was about conventional means of capitalism and why they're preferable, then we need to recognize that under conventional capitalism, there are even more harmful ways that competition is. We tell you that the driving down in wages for low-skilled individuals, we tell you that planned obsolescence are things that are a lot more harmful than targeted ads that you see on your Facebook that actually show you some kind of benefit. So we told you that even on competition, they really use why surveillance capitalism is something that is worse. But on to the second and more important question in this debate then, is whether surveillance capitalism actually harms people and whether this harm is something, for instance, that is regrettable. Important to recognize in France's speech, which hasn't been analyzed and isn't responded to sufficiently in closing, is that we need to recognize that this rise is something that does not occur in a vacuum. Like the rise of any other means, not just in capitalism, but in any means of our evolution as individuals, this rise is something that happens with regulations and changes that ensure that we improve the life, that ensure that we improve the ways in which people interact with us in the future. Important to recognize here then is that if it is going to happen, if the rise in surveillance capitalism is going to happen, if we're going to continue to live more of our life online, then it needs to occur in a way that we're able to regulate. We show you why that's something that occurs on our side. We think then that the rise is something that is necessary to ensure that in the way that it exists in the future, it exists under conditions that are more beneficial to individuals and aren't harmful, even if the harms from that rise of things are not necessarily argued by any of the government teams. Important then is under the assumptions that government makes, which is an analysis that Francois gives you, then we need to respond then to what closing government tells us about the privacy and the commodification thereof. Recognize here that commodification in itself isn't a bad word, right? So for instance, having your privacy, having your information commodified in itself isn't something that is harmful, and they don't prove to us why outside of merely stating that it's commodified as something that is necessarily bad. But secondly, they also say that people use the ability to make their kinds of choices and they use the ability to be autonomous. What we need to recognize here is that every single type of choice that you have made about the clothes that you wear, about the institution that you attend for university, about the course that you study, about the food that you eat, all of these choices are informed by some kind of marketing tool. There are no choices that you make as an individual that are free. What they need to tell us then is why this specific type of choice that you make based on surveillance capitalism is on that is so harmful that it ought to be regrettable. They don't give us that analysis. No, thank you. What we'd say then is all marketing something that is invasive, and all marketing then should be banned. If individuals ought to make truly free choices, they don't show us why this is something that occurs, right? So then your right to choose something that you're able, then your right to choose something that always occurs. I'll take closing.
All right, so don't you think there's a difference between what you just analyzed and deliberate misinformation that you give to people, all in the name of like convincing or nudging their choices?
Two responses to that, right? The first, then they need to show us that deliberate disinformation is something that is inherent to surveillance capitalism. We tell you that that's something that's not true. But secondly, on their analysis of information, we tell you that leaving out information, or for instance, or people being able to find out more about a product by themselves and things that occur in other types of industries, but it's not something that's specifically intrinsic to this as well. We tell you that disinformation isn't something that occurs to such an extent that it is as harmful as they tell us. But we also then need to recognize that more than this thing not being regrettable is something that is actually important to people's lives. What Francois shows you is that there are very important benefits for having these platforms to exist. But more importantly, is that ads, and especially targeted ads and surveillance capitalism, creates the conditions for Facebook to continue being free, for Twitter and Instagram to continue being free. The reason that this is important, not just because individuals have a lot more access to information, even to be able to investigate information that you talk about on platforms that are free and platforms that aren't elitist, that only certain individuals would have access to. But Facebook has given us the ability to organize international conferences such as PAUDC on a platform that is completely free. So we tell you that at worst, that individuals' choices are, for instance, influenced by factors that are outside of their control, and which is what we tell you that occurs in every other type of society, in every other type of capitalism. But at the very best, what surveillance capitalism has allowed is conditions that ensure that platforms that are as revolutionary and that ensure that the kind of access that individuals have to information, the kind of access that individuals have to communication on things that continue to be included. Targeted ads are very small price to pay for that. We have very hard to afford.